Hi, this is Synthchaser from Synthchaser.com. I'm in ARP Quadra mode again. Over the last few years of buying broken synths, I've literally accumulated a quartet of Quadras here. And it's about time to get one or two of them ready to go out into the world again. So I'm about to start on this one, and I figured I might shoot some video in case anything interesting comes up along the way. I've already done a fairly comprehensive series of videos on restoring and repairing the ARP Quadra a year or two back. I'll have that series linked at the end of this video in case you missed it. So if nothing interesting comes up on this one, this video may never see the light of day, and I'm just talking to myself here. Anyway, the Quadra in the last series of videos was really nice. Nearly mint condition, locked away in a road case and forgotten about by time. This one, not so much. I overpaid for this one on eBay a few years back, and the seller didn't do a very good job of packing. The ARP Quadra uses two types of sliders. The 6 sliders here in the mixer section are this type of slider, which is used in a lot of other ARPs like the Odyssey, the Avatar, the Axe, the Omni, Pro Soloist, and so on. These I've had remanufactured and have new replacements available for my repairs and for sale on my website. Then the remaining 29 sliders are this type of slider, which is a little shorter than the other one. And these are only used in the Quadra and the Solus. So due to low demand and high minimum order quantities, it's not economically viable to have these remanufactured. Getting back to this Quadra, you'll see that every single one of these sliders, these obsolete sliders here on the panel, the slider shaft is sheared right off. The ones that I have replacements for, they made it okay, but the ones that I don't have replacements for, all destroyed. Actually one down here on the portamento board, this one made it. But the thing is so stiff it doesn't really matter anyway. Believe it or not, this damage wasn't caused by the seller's packaging job. It was this way before, and I was actually crazy enough to buy it from him like this. Now that I've got a 3D printer, I've designed some replacement shafts, and I'll be transplanting them into the sliders on this machine. It would have actually been better if the sliders all got broken during shipping, because then at least I'd have the slider caps in the box. The seller said he had the original slider caps and would include them, but of course he didn't. And then, despite following up, he never sent them afterwards. So I'm going to have to scrounge around to see if I can find enough originals. 3D printed parts don't look quite right. So no doubt you've also noticed the key bed sitting here outside of the synthesizer with no keys. As you may or may not know, the keys on ARP synths hang over the end of the keyboard, kind of like this. So it's very easy for them to get damaged in transit. And the seller knew this about ARPs, and he had a solution. Instead of packing the keyboard really, really well, his solution was just to take the keys off before he shipped it. Now, the problem was, when you take the keys off, these little J-wire guides, there's nothing holding them on. So they slid off the J-wires and got loose in the synth and the box, and some managed to leave the box through holes in the box, as did some of the screws, the key springs, and a bunch of other hardware. I pulled the key bed out to try to gather as much of the hardware, the loose hardware that I could. So we're short hardware, like all the screws for the keys and other little bits, which will no doubt make for countless little surprises along the way to fixing this. But we have the little key carrier levers here, and then we have the keys here, and I've already given them a rinse because they were pretty filthy to start with. Anyway, pulling the key bed brought to my attention this circuit board, the keyboard electronic circuit board that connects to the key bed with these headers into these sockets here. This board sits right under the alkaline battery holder on the CPU board, which is about here. And check out what happened to this guy. Those alkaline batteries leaked and corroded the board. And there's often some corrosion on this board in Quadras, but this is hands down the worst I've seen on a Quadra. So super fun times ahead cleaning this up. I also pulled the CPU board of this Quadra. You may or may not remember, but back in the last series of Quadra videos, I tracked down a problem which was due to the CPU chip being dead. The CPU in the Quadra is a mask ROM CPU chip, meaning that it has the ROM with the firmware code burned onto it at the factory. So if the CPU is dead, you can't just grab any 8048 CPU chip and be back in business. You need a special variant with the correct code programmed into it. So back in that video, I stole the CPU chip from this Quadra to fix that Quadra. So now we have no CPU chip in this machine. Back then people were asking what I was going to do as a real solution, because if I keep stealing CPUs from the next Quadra, eventually I'll have to pay the piper. So I'm just going to buckle down and deal with it for this Quadra. I pulled the power supply out a while back and I recapped it when I thought I may do all 4 Quadras plus one for a customer at the same time. But I quickly ran out of space to work on 5 Quadras in parallel, and I shelved this one. We've also got a sheared off slide switch, and of course the 100+ capacitors that have to be changed out to make the Quadra reliable. These gating capacitors on the upper and lower voicing board are sometimes tantalum and sometimes electrolytic in the Quadra. This time they're electrolytic, but we're going to recap them anyway. But the good news is this. The seller said the keyboard is working. Yeah, so like if you kind of grip onto this stub of the slider shaft and move it around, the keyboard's going to work perfectly. Right. So now you've got an idea of the state of this machine and the problems that I know I'm up against. So yeah, I'm pretty sure this video will see the light of day. I'm going to go ahead and get started with this one, and I'll grab the camera for the interesting bits. Here are the 3 boards with the sliders. Turns out one of these mixer sliders did have the slider shaft sheared off or broken off, and it was just kind of hanging on there. So what we're going to do is we're going to take all the sliders out from these 3 boards. This is kind of what they look like. You can see there's stuff down in them, and it looks like they need a haircut or a shave or something like that. But what we're going to do is we're going to take these out. The mixer ones we're going to replace with my replacement sliders, new replacements. These we have no choice but to refurbish. And what we're going to do is we're going to completely disassemble them, clean them in the ultrasonic cleaner, and then replace them with the 3D printed slider shafts that I showed just before. And then we're going to test each one of them out under the oscilloscope to make sure they're functioning correctly and don't have any scratchiness, which visually shows as like little dropouts on the scope. Plus we have some recapping to do. There are some tantalum capacitors. Interestingly though, these 10 microfarad capacitors are aluminum electrolytic on this set of boards. Usually they're tantalum. And we're also going to pull the 2 voltage controlled filter submodules out. These are 4075s. And I'm going to recap them, do the frequency cutoff correction or enhancement, and then I'm going to test them with my test fixture to make sure they're working before we put them back in. So these are the sliders just after vacuuming off the surface dirt and dust. Well, it makes a big difference. Now think about this. If you have your synthesizer and it's working okay, but you have a scratchy slider, and they happen to look like ours did here before I vacuumed them, and you squirt some contact cleaner through the little slot in the panel, what you'd be doing is you'd be pushing all that dust and dirt that was on there down into the slider and actually making things worse. Really the only way to repair these or refurbish these sliders is to remove them from the circuit board and disassemble them and clean them out when they're disassembled. And that is what I'm about to do. I'm in the middle of cleaning the sliders now, and I thought I'd show you what they look like inside. So this is one half of the slider, and it has the carbon track and the metallic track. And you can see there's all kinds of grime on that. These have to be cleaned by hand. They can't be cleaned with the ultrasonic cleaner because the ultrasonic cleaner may lift part of the carbon track. So this is what they look like after they've been cleaned by hand. No greasy goo, no dust, no dirt, and that's what they look like before. This is the other half of the housing, and you can see that there's these don't look as bad as a lot of them, but there's a lot of lubricant in there, and over time on the Quadra, this lubricant that's in these sliders really turns into cement. So these have to be cleaned, and all that old lubricant and dust and stuff needs to be removed. And then these are the wipers for the sliders. They're going to go in the ultrasonic cleaner. And there's the one slider shaft that wasn't broken on this keyboard, so that'll go in as well. And then when everything is all cleaned up, we'll lubricate it and put it back together. As part of the testing for these sliders, we're powering them up with the benchtop power supply. You can use any voltage. I'm using 5 volts, and I'm connecting the oscilloscope to the lead for the wiper. And then I'm going to exercise the slider shaft just back and forth like this. And I'm going to take a look at the oscilloscope to make sure that the taper is correct and that there's no scratchiness or dropouts. So you can see that this is a linear taper pot, and there's no dropouts, which would manifest itself as scratchiness when you have it back in the synthesizer. And it's better to find that out now before we put the sliders back in than afterwards. This is one with a audio or logarithmic taper. This is one of the sliders from the mixer section of this Quadra that we're restoring, and it's pretty stiff, so let's see what it will look like doing the same test. So you see that's all those dropouts. That is will manifest itself as scratchiness when you pass an audio signal through it. While I have the capacitors and the sliders out and I'm working on this board, one thing that I always do is I check the Tempco resistors. So ARP uses a 1.87K Tempco resistor that provides temperature compensation to the oscillators by adjusting in resistance as the temperature goes up and down. So these do tend to fail, and particularly on Quadras, so we can measure them here. So this one is 1.824K, which is fine. And the other one is 62.1K. So we have a problem, and this Tempco is bad and needs to be replaced. But what the seller said that the synthesizer was working properly is looking less and less likely now because one of the oscillators doesn't work. And sure enough, this Tempco resistor is bad. It's measuring open circuit. Generally, in-circuit measurements of resistance aren't very accurate, but in this case it was good enough to be able to tell that one of our 2 oscillators, Tempcos, was bad. So right now I'm in the process of recapping these voicing boards, and I mentioned that these have electrolytic capacitors here for the gating capacitors instead of the tantalum, which we find so much in most other Quadras and ARP Omni 2 and ARP Omni 1. And the tantalums absolutely have to be changed, and I am changing the electrolytic ones that are here anyway. They may very well be okay, and the reason that I'm changing them is because they don't get any better with age. They're not in the audio path of the synthesizer. So if I'm going through and I'm overhauling this Quadra to give it the longest possible lifespan after it leaves me, why wouldn't I change these out? I mean, it takes some time because there's 49 of them, but that's no big deal. I'm not billing anyone for this labor. This is just what I feel is necessary to get the keyboard overhauled. Anyway, as I pulled this lower voicing board, I'm looking down here and I see a mess. So these resistors here, at some point somebody has cut them, presumably to try to figure out some problem in this area, and they've soldered them back on. Just the ones that they cut off, they soldered them on the component side of the board. A resistor costs like a cent or less than a cent each. Why on earth would you do that? Just put a new one in when you cut an old one out like that. So when I see areas like this on the keyboard, this chip here is new, this chip looks like it was removed and put back in. When I see areas like this where large quantities of components have been touched or removed and put back in, it's generally because someone was trying to troubleshoot a problem that was beyond their scope of their abilities. So I wouldn't be confident that there still isn't a problem in this area. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to strip this whole area. So I'm going to take these 2 chips out. I'm going to take all these resistors out. I'm going to put in all new stuff. And if there is a problem, I'll troubleshoot it and find out where it really is. But basically, looking at this work that's here, I don't trust the work that was done by whoever did this. So I'm just going to rip it out and start fresh. Here's that area all cleaned up. All the resistors that were cut and resoldered and the diodes that were cut and resoldered have been replaced. The IC chips that had been removed and replaced have been removed. They actually tested okay, but I went ahead and put new chips in brand new sockets. The thought is, if I'm going to take the time to take them out, I might as well replace them with new chips. They'll last longer than the chips that were there, and that's the goal, is to make this reliable. So I also cleaned up all the flux residue that was on both sides of the boards. It was quite messy in this area where there had been the rework. So we'll see if there's a problem there that never got resolved, or if the person's prior work in that area took care of it. We'll find out when we get to testing it, but at least it's acceptable quality workmanship there now. So another good thing about taking a synthesizer down to its chassis when doing a restoration is you find stuff like this. There was like a little piece of tape on the lock load switch here. This little single pole, single throw switch here on the back of the keyboard for the memory protect. There's a little piece of tape on it, and I pulled it, and the switch came apart. So the switch broke at some point. And that's fairly common on the Quadras because the switch sticks out quite a bit in the back. But instead of replacing it or actually doing a decent repair, someone put a little piece of packing tape on it to hold it in place. So we're going to replace this switch. I'm on to the microprocessor board now, and the battery holder, which I mentioned sits above the keyboard electronics board, and is 3 alkaline batteries, which inevitably will leak. You can see here the battery holder is corroded, so this is going to need to come off. And on the back side, you can see that corrosion has kind of eaten through here to this one trace, so we're going to have to clean that up. And on the other side of the battery terminal, you can see that there is a cracked, let me get my finger in there, there's a cracked solder joint, so this battery holder wasn't even doing anything anyway. So what we're going to do is we're going to remove the battery holder, we're going to clean up that little bit of corrosion, and then we're going to wire in a new external off-board battery holder, and we're going to put it in a part of the case where if it leaks, it does absolutely no damage. The CPU chip was a little bit of an effort to get resolved. So in the previous video series, I had taken the CPU chip from this Quadra to replace this chip from the other Quadra that was bad. I have a couple of ROM burners, a modern one and a really old one from the mid-early 80s, and none of them would support the programmable variant of this 8048 CPU. So it took a little bit tracking down, but I got my hands on a burner and adapter that would support this, and then I went to go copy the ROM from another Quadra, and it turned out the CPU was bad in that Quadra too. Well, it's a good thing I have so many Quadras, because eventually I found one with a good CPU chip, and I was able to make a replacement. So to save other people the hassle of that, I'm going to get some extra chips and make the CPU chips available on my website. But yeah, I mean, if in 5 Quadras I had at least two bad CPU chips, that must be a fairly common failure point, so it's good to have a solution like this. So we'll pop that in here, and we'll rig up the battery holder and finish recapping this board, and then we can move on to the next board. Here's that keyboard electronics board that had the battery drip down onto it. And what we're going to do is we're going to take everything out that's anywhere near these corroded tracks. So we're going to take all these resistors out up here, capacitors, this chip, this chip, this chip, this chip, these resistors. Yeah, that should do it. And then we're going to clean all the corrosion off the tracks of the PCB. We're going to put new sockets in for new IC chips, and we're going to put new resistors in. And it'll be just like new. Here are these components that I trimmed off the board. I even took this little cable off because I noticed a little bit of corrosion on the strands of the wire, the purple wire in there. And anyway, that'll give me nice access to sand this down and get all that corrosion off. But this is what it looks like all stripped down. So this IC and these resistors, they were okay, but you can see the little corrosion was kind of creeping under there. So I'd have to take that IC out anyway to clean that up. So we are going to get this junk all removed. And this is what it looks like with all the corrosion sanded away. I use sandpaper, so I'm making very nasty lead and fiberglass dust. So do this in a well-ventilated area, not on your kitchen table or anything like that. The areas that are kind of copperish, I had to sand more than other areas because the corrosion went further down. So I actually had to get into the copper tracks. In other areas, the corrosion just came off the tin plating pretty easily. On other boards that I've done, not necessarily Quadra boards, but the tracks had been so corroded that you actually, they're corroded all the way through, and when you sand them, you actually sand through the track, and then you have to put a jumper wire or something to correct the traces. But this wasn't too bad. It looked a lot worse than it was. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to solder out the pins from all the components that I cut off. And it was really nice that the corrosion didn't make it to the other side of the board. So all the corrosion we were dealing with was on the component side of the board. Because I didn't think I damaged my health enough, I gave it another hit with sandpaper after I desoldered all the little remnants of component leads, and now I'm totally confident that there's no corrosion left there to eat away these tracks. Yeah, the copper's exposed and it will oxidize, but oxidize does not corrode. It just creates a little layer of oxide on top of the copper trace. The battery acid that was there would corrode away the traces over time, so it's not a big deal that I'm leaving exposed copper traces here. And here we go. That side of the board has been rebuilt and we're ready to move on. So I'm all done with the general work and I've got everything back together, and I'm plugged into the main output, and there is no sound coming out of it. So right now I'm plugged into the lead output. Not bad considering I haven't calibrated anything yet. But so the lead is working, polysynth is working, strings are working, but unfortunately bass is just a click. So let's bust it open and find out why. So for the bass, the oscillator is actually working, but it's going very, very slowly. As you can see here on the oscilloscope, you can see the level dropping very slowly, oh so slowly, and then resetting. So there is a problem in this area, but fortunately it's towards the beginning of the circuit. Then perhaps the exponential converter would be what we look at next. So for the main output, I'm looking at the main output mixers and VCA section of the lead mix board. And what I found is an op-amp here, and I'll flash the schematic in just a second. An op-amp that's configured as a non-inverting buffer. So there's a voltage divider. Actually, I'll flash the schematic now. So there's a voltage divider here between 15 volts and ground that should give us about 2 volts-ish. And it's supplied to the non-inverting input of this op-amp Z25 on pin 5. And then the inverting input is tied to the output, which is what makes it a non-inverting buffer, or just a buffer. So we should expect to see the same thing on pin 7 that we see on pin 5, which should be about 2 volts. So taking a look here at the actual op-amp, so here's pin 5, and I'll raise this up a little bit here. So that's 2 volts on pin 5, and then pin 7 is sitting at -1 volt. So there doesn't appear to be anything downstream that would pull that down, and again the op-amp is going to try its darndest to keep its output at what it should be. So I'm suspecting this op-amp is likely bad. So we're going to pull that board and take that op-amp out and test it. And sure enough, in my little op-amp tester, the op-amp that was right there at Z25 is deader than a doornail. For reference, here's the new chip in the op-amp tester. You see these 2A and 2B LEDs are flashing. That's because both halves of that dual op-amp are now or are working correctly. The exponential converter issue for the base oscillator could have been avoided, I think. I made the whole big deal about checking the temp codes, and I found that one of the VCOs for the lead synth, the temp code was bad. And I guess I was so caught up in how lucky I was that I found that problem preemptively that I forgot to check this temp code. And you can see that this temp code measures very high resistance, 140 kilo ohms. Should be around 1.87K. So I'm suspecting that this is the problem with our exponential converter. I'm going to change the temp code and then we'll test out the base. So you can see that it actually takes longer to get these boards out from underneath the daughter board and all the different wires and cables that are connected and passing over it. It takes longer to get the boards out than it does to actually make a repair to the board. So definitely it's a real pain to take these, particularly these two large circuit boards out and work on them. And lo and behold, with that one op amp and the second temp code there changed, we now have bass and we have our main mix. And the next problem was found pretty quickly because it was the only thing I couldn't test without the mixer working, and that's the phase shifter. So here's strings, and here's strings through the phase shifter. We'll turn resonance off first. Turn resonance on. And it does pretty much nothing except add some clicking to the output. So there's a problem with the phase shifter. And the phase shifter has been repaired. The phase shifter is this board that sits in the back of the case here. And at the top there are these 3086 chips, which are transistor arrays, obsolete chip. And they form the ladder network of the phase shifter. And I'll flash the schematic so you can see that. And the problem was a single transistor in that transistor network was bad. So replace the chip, and now the phase shifter is working. And then finally there's the matter of the batteries. The batteries were mounted here. They're 3 alkaline batteries, and they leaked, and they corroded the board here a little bit. And they dripped down here onto the keyboard electronics board and corroded that a lot. So what I've done to remedy the problem and make sure it doesn't happen again is I've removed the old corroded battery holder, and I've added a wiring that comes down here along this wiring and comes here to a little battery holder mounted in the bottom of the case. There's a little lid on it, and inside, open it up, if I can do it one-handed. Well, I can't do it one-handed, but it opens up and there's 3 alkaline batteries inside of it. They're not rechargeable, that's why they're alkaline batteries. If this batteries ever leak, this little case can be disconnected from this connector and thrown away, and a new one put in there. It doesn't leak onto any circuit boards, doesn't do any permanent damage to the keyboard. So now all the major functionality of the keyboard is working, so I'm going to go ahead and calibrate it and tune it and button it up. Now the Quadra is all buttoned up. I managed to find enough of the original slider caps for all of them, and it's looking a lot better than when we started. But most importantly, it's working now. Unless you buy from someone reputable online, like me, you never know what you're going to get. This was supposed to be working, but the bass section, VCO2, the main output mixer, and the phase shifter were all hosed. And that was after recapping and going over everything. Well, this was a lot of work to bring back to life. The extra effort forced me to create some new parts like the CPU chip and the slider shafts, which are available now on my website to help others bring their Quadras back to life. This Quadra will be for sale on my website, synthchaser.com, and like I usually do for synths that I've got for sale, I'm going to make a detailed video showing all the functionality is working. So if you'd like to see more of this particular Quadra, click through to the link and watch the demo video. This has been Synthchaser from synthchaser.com. Thanks for watching, and have a great day.